Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be going into the life and work of Erwin Chargaff.
Erwin Chargaff.
Right, a biochemist who I think it's safe to say left his mark on science and history.
Definitely.
And we've got his memoir, Heraclitean Fire, ready to go. And this is not your average
Right.
scientist's autobiography.
Not at all. I
Yeah.
mean, you've got sharp wit, historical observations, just healthy doses of skepticism alongside this incredible scientific journey. I mean, Chargaff lived through a really tumultuous period in history.
Mhm.
2 world wars, the rise of fascism, and of course, the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And those events really shaped his views on science and on humanity.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up his writing because I was going to say his childhood already sounds fascinating. Growing up in Vienna in the early 1900s, he describes himself as a ridiculously polymathic kid devouring encyclopedias, fascinated by theater and literature and language.
It's really key to understanding Chargaff because that broad intellectual foundation is really what makes him so interesting. He wasn't just a scientist working in a lab, he was a thinker.
Yeah.
And he drew connections between different fields. So he saw the beauty of language and the nuances of expression and felt very much that science sometimes missed those subtleties. And even, he criticized some scientists as being merely molecular podiatrists.
Molecular podiatrist.
Yeah.
Okay, you got to explain that one to me.
So that's a great example of his wit,
Okay.
right? He's comparing them to someone who's focused on a tiny detail, like a foot doctor.
Right.
Without appreciating the whole body, or in this case, the bigger scientific picture.
Right.
So he really believed in looking beyond the narrow confines of just a single discipline.
Right, and that makes sense, especially considering, the greater context of his life. You mentioned those historical upheavals that he lived through, and he even lost his own mother, who was deported from Vienna during the Holocaust. He writes that she was deported into nothingness, which is just heartbreaking. And I mean, it just makes you realize how those events must have colored his worldview.
Absolutely. He
Mhm.
saw firsthand the dark side of human nature and the destructive potential of, ideology and technology. And this really fueled his skepticism towards blind faith and progress.
Right.
And, he even talks about what he calls this boyish grin,
Okay.
with which deception was so often acknowledged in America.
It's a reminder that scientists, aren't just working in a vacuum.
Yeah.
They're products of their times, shaped by the world around them.
Right.
And speaking of unconventional paths, his journey to science wasn't exactly straightforward either, was it?
Not at all. I mean, he didn't have that classic calling story.
Right.
He actually started with chemistry for what he called frivolous reasons. He was inspired by an uncle who had some alcohol refineries
Oh.
in Poland, which of course promised great wealth, but ultimately vanished.
So no early experiments in the basement?
Apparently not.
Okay.
But this unplanned entry into science
Mm-hmm.
is actually crucial, I think, to understanding Chargaff's philosophy, because he believed that true scientists are driven by this sense of mystery, his deep curiosity about the world, not just a desire for career advancement.
And that sense of mystery led him to some pretty incredible places, from the bustling Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes in Berlin to Columbia University in New York. I mean, he experienced quite a range of scientific environments.
He had very strong opinions about those environments, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, he contrasted the close-knit, almost family-like atmosphere of his early days in science with what he called the scientific mass society that emerged later on.
Okay.
And he felt that this shift towards larger, more competitive research environments led to a real loss of intimacy and a decline in genuine scientific tradition.
Yeah, I can see how someone who valued intellectual curiosity and deep thinking might feel a little stifled in a system that's obsessed with, constant novelty and competition. It's like the pressure to publish overshadows the actual pursuit of knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this brings us to, I think, a pivotal moment in his journey, his encounter with Oswald Avery's groundbreaking research on DNA.
Ugh.
The famous Avery experiment showing that DNA, not protein, was the carrier of genetic information.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And this discovery just seemed to ignite Chargaff's imagination. He describes DNA as the cryptographer hidden in every soul. And he really dedicated himself to unraveling its secrets.
So he dives into this world of DNA research, and it eventually leads him to one of his most significant contributions, Chargaff's rules.
Right.
Can you remind us what those are and why they're so important?
Sure. So, through meticulous analysis of DNA from various sources, he discovered that the amounts of adenine and thymine in DNA were always nearly equal, as were the amounts of guanine and cytosine.
Okay.
And these base pairing rules, as they're known, became fundamental to understanding DNA structure and really paved the way for Watson and Crick's famous double helix model.
So Chargaff's work laid the groundwork for one of the biggest scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century.
He played a crucial role, but it's interesting to note that his own view of these discoveries was a lot more complex. He
Yeah.
famously said that nature reads Braille.
Implying that science, despite its advances, was still somewhat blind to the deeper mysteries of life.
Now that's an intriguing thought.
Yeah.
What do you think he meant by that?
Well, he believed that scientific knowledge, while powerful, is inherently limited. So we might be able to decipher the code, but there's always more to uncover.
Right.
Deeper layers of meaning that remain hidden. It's like we're only scratching the surface,
Mm.
reading the raised dots, but missing the full story behind them.
It's a reminder that even with groundbreaking discoveries like the structure of DNA, there's always more to learn, always more to question.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And for Chargaff, this realization wasn't just some, philosophical musing. It actually fueled a growing disillusionment with the direction science was heading.
Okay.
He saw this increasing focus on stunts and breakthroughs, a sort of what he called a herostratic element that prioritized fame and recognition over genuine understanding.
Wait, herostratic element. I'm not familiar with that term.
So that actually refers to Herostratus,
That's-
a Greek man who burned down the Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, just to achieve notoriety.
Oh, wow.
So Chargaff uses this analogy to critique the pursuit of fame in science, suggesting that some researchers are more interested in making a name for themselves than in actually advancing true knowledge.
So he saw a kind of destructive ambition creeping into the scientific world, this shift away from the pure joy of discovery that he valued so much.
Precisely. And this disillusionment led him to advocate for what he called small science,
Okay.
research that was driven by human conscience and a desire to understand the world rather than by ambition or the pursuit of technological power.
It's a powerful message, especially coming from someone who made such significant contributions, to our understanding of DNA.
It makes you think about the motivations behind scientific research and the potential consequences of prioritizing the wrong goals.
And it makes me even more curious to learn about his later work and how these critiques evolved.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got this brilliant scientist who's becoming increasingly wary of what he sees as the wrong kind of ambition, driving scientific progress. And all of this is unfolding against the backdrop of this changing scientific landscape, from those intimate research groups to what he called the scientific mass society.
Yeah, and he was quite critical of this trend. And he actually uses a very specific anecdote to illustrate his point. He talks about attending a scientific meeting with 4 colleagues, and each one could claim to be the favorite pupil of Otto Meyerhoff, who was a Nobel laureate.
So it's not just about the size of the research groups, but also this emphasis on lineage and connections. It's like scientific pedigree was becoming more important than the ideas themselves.
Exactly. That's what Chargaff was getting at. He saw this pedigree-conscious science as a symptom of a larger problem, this belief that scientific greatness could be inherited or passed down through mentorship rather than emerging from, individual passion and insight.
But didn't he benefit from mentorship himself? I mean, he worked with some prominent scientists throughout his career.
He did, and he acknowledged the importance of good mentors. But he also believed that true scientific breakthroughs came from this unique intensity and originality of vision, something that couldn't be simply taught or inherited.
So it's about striking a balance, recognizing the value of mentorship while also encouraging independent thinking, and a willingness to challenge, established ideas, which makes me wonder, how did Chargaff view his own scientific journey, especially considering, his somewhat unconventional path?
He reflects on this quite a bit in his memoir, particularly his early days in America. So he arrived in New York in 1928, a young scientist fresh off a boat, and it wasn't exactly a smooth start. He was actually detained at Ellis Island because of an issue with his visa.
Wow, not the warmest welcome to the land of opportunity.
It definitely clashed with his expectations, and he was quite critical of American culture, initially finding it superficial and obsessed with material wealth. And he even describes feeling a sense of homelessness and fear walking the streets of New York.
It's easy to romanticize a new place before you actually experience it firsthand.
Yeah, he admits as much in the memoir. He even pokes fun at his own naivete. He writes about expecting to see crocodiles in the Hudson River and Sioux on the warpath in Manhattan.
Oh, wow.
It's a reminder that even brilliant scientists can have, misconceptions about the world outside their field.
It also shows his sense of humor, which is something that, we see throughout his writing. He doesn't shy away from self-deprecation or poking fun at the absurdity of human behavior, even his own.
Absolutely. He was a keen observer of human nature and had a real talent for capturing those little details that reveal the humor and the irony of life.
So how did he eventually find his way to Columbia University?
It was a bit of a winding road. He initially had a fellowship at Yale, but he was drawn to the work of Hans Clark at Columbia's biochemistry department.
Yeah.
And he describes Clark's department as a happy family, but one with unhappy members.
Okay, that sounds almost paradoxical. What did he mean by that?
So he's playing with the idea of happiness here. He recognized that the department had a great leader in Clark and a group of brilliant scientists, but many of them were struggling because they were working within a medical school.
And we know how Chargaff felt about the increasing emphasis on the medical applications of science. He believed it stifled true scientific inquiry.
Exactly. He felt that the pressure to produce practical results, particularly in a medical setting, could distract from the pure pursuit of knowledge. He even writes, "It is regrettable that most biological research has become concentrated in the medical schools."
So how did he manage to pursue his own research interest within this environment, particularly his work on DNA?
He found a niche within the department, focusing on the chemical differences between DNA from various sources. And this was a relatively unexplored area at the time, and he was essentially forging his own path.
And this is where his meticulous analysis of DNA composition comes into play, right? The work that ultimately led to those famous Chargaff's rules.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that his research wasn't driven by some grand ambition to become famous or to solve the mysteries of life. It was about something much simpler, a fascination with the exquisiteness of minute differences. He was genuinely curious about what made DNA from different species unique.
It's refreshing to hear about a scientist motivated by pure curiosity, especially in an era where we often hear about the pressure to produce, groundbreaking results and secure funding.
Right. He definitely stands out in that regard. He even describes his own surprise at discovering the regularity of base ratios in DNA. He says this form of equipoise had never having been encountered in nature. I was perhaps more confused than happy about the discovery.
He was confused by his own breakthrough. That's classic Chargaff. So how did his colleagues react to his findings? Was there immediate recognition of their significance?
Not really. He presented his results at several lectures in Europe, but no one seemed particularly interested. He later wrote that the scientific climate was not yet ready to accept ideas on biological information.
So his work was groundbreaking, but it took a while for the rest of the scientific community to catch up.
It wasn't until Watson and Crick proposed the double helix model that the true significance of Chargaff's rules became widely appreciated.
And even then, didn't he feel somewhat overlooked? I recall reading that Watson and Crick didn't fully acknowledge his contributions.
That's true. He felt that the beneficiaries of his findings didn't adequately recognize his role, which definitely fueled his disillusionment with the direction of science. He saw this as another example of the herostratic element at play, a focus on individual glory rather than a collaborative spirit of discovery.
Yeah, that's going to be frustrating, especially after being so generous with his knowledge, sharing his early findings with Watson and Crick.
He was deeply disappointed. But he also used this experience to further his critique of the changing scientific landscape. He felt that the emphasis on stunts and breakthroughs had created a system where discoveries were born dead, mere tokens in a power game.
It's almost like he saw science becoming a spectator sport, focused on competition and individual achievement, rather than the collaborative pursuit of knowledge.
He even went so far as to say that the rapid pace of research and the pressure to publish had created this Babylonian confusion of mind and language. He felt that scientists were losing sight of the fundamental purpose of their work, to understand the world, not simply to publish papers or win awards.
So what did he do with this growing sense of disillusionment? Did he retreat from the scientific world entirely?
He continued his research, but he also became increasingly vocal in his critiques of modern science and its impact on society. He wrote essays, gave lectures, and even composed dialogues that explored the ethical and philosophical implications of scientific progress.
So he became a sort of conscience for the scientific community, a voice urging a more thoughtful and responsible approach to research.
Exactly. He wasn't anti-science by any means, but he was deeply concerned about the direction it was taking and the potential consequences of prioritizing the wrong goals.
It's inspiring to see someone who achieved such significant scientific success using their platform to advocate for a more ethical and humane approach to research.
Yeah, he was a unique voice, a scientist who never shied away from asking difficult questions about the role of science in shaping the world around us.
And one of his most provocative ideas was this concept of a disinventors club.
Ah, yes, the Disinventors Club. That was one of his most intriguing and perhaps misunderstood proposals.
Can you tell us more about it? What exactly did he envision?
Well, he proposed it as a way to undo some of the harmful inventions that had been unleashed upon the world. He imagined a group of scientists dedicated to dismantling or reversing the negative impacts of technology.
That sounds almost like science fiction. Was he being serious, or was it more of a satirical commentary on the hubris of scientific progress?
He was known for his sharp wit, but I believe there was a deep sincerity underlying this idea. He genuinely felt that science had a responsibility to consider the consequences of its creations. Yeah. He wasn't anti-technology, but he was cautious about its unchecked power and the potential for unintended harm.
And I can see how his experiences, living through two world wars and witnessing the destructive potential of technology, would have influenced this view.
Absolutely. He saw firsthand how scientific advancements could be used for both good and evil, and he wanted to ensure that the benefits of science outweighed the risks.
It makes you wonder what he would think of the world today with the rise of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and all these other powerful technologies that are reshaping our lives.
It's hard to say for sure, but based on his writings, I think he would urge us to proceed with extreme caution. He was deeply concerned about the dehumanization of society, the erosion of individual character in the face of mass culture and technological advancement.
One of the most striking images in his memoir is his description of living in a sewer where the juices of a rotting epoch drain. It's a pretty bleak outlook.
He was definitely a pessimist, but he wasn't without hope. He also wrote that nothing that has been done or thought is ever lost. He believed that even in the darkest of times, there's always the potential for renewal and rediscovery.
There's a resilience there, a belief in the enduring power of human thought and expression. And it's interesting that he saw so much continuity between the arts and sciences. He even wrote that, "From where I sit, stand, or lie, the sciences are not essentially different from the arts. I only wish they could have remained equally useless."
He felt that both were driven by this fundamental human need to create, to explore, to make sense of the world around us. And he lamented the fact that science had become so entangled with practical applications, with the pursuit of usefulness above all else.
It's a reminder that science at its heart is a deeply human endeavor driven by curiosity and a desire for understanding. And that's something that often gets lost in the race for funding, publications, and prestige.
Chargaff's life and work serve as a powerful reminder that we need to be mindful of the kind of science and the kind of world we are creating. He urged us to consider not just what we can do, but what we should do. It's a call for a more ethical and humane approach to scientific progress, one that prioritizes human values and the well-being of future generations.
So what does this all mean for us today? What can we learn from Erwin Chargaff's life and his reflections on science?
I think he would urge us to cultivate a sense of humility in the face of the vast unknowns of the universe, to resist the temptation to reduce everything to simple explanations, and to remember that the pursuit of knowledge should be driven by a genuine desire to understand, not just to control. He also reminds us that science is not a neutral force. It's shaped by human values and can be used for good or for ill. Ultimately, we have a responsibility to choose what kind of science we want to create and what kind of future we want to build.
Yeah, it really does make you kind of stop and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Here's the scientist who achieved this major breakthrough, but instead of just basking in the glory, he becomes increasingly concerned about the very nature of scientific progress.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what makes Chargaff so fascinating. He doesn't fit that mold of the typical, scientific hero.
Right.
He's brilliant, he's witty, he's doubly insightful, but he's also, skeptical, pessimistic at times, and ultimately deeply humane.
And you mentioned his concept of the Disinventors Club earlier, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. What kinds of inventions did he have in mind when he proposed this idea?
Well, he doesn't provide a specific list in his memoir.
Okay.
But he talks about wanting to reverse the harmful effects of technology on society, on the environment.
Right.
So I think it's more about the principle of recognizing that not all scientific advancements are beneficial, and that we have this responsibility to consider the potential downsides.
So it's not about literally, undoing inventions, but rather about critically evaluating their impact and potentially mitigating, the negative consequences.
Exactly. It's about shifting our mindset from this purely celebratory view of scientific progress to a more nuanced and cautious approach.
Which brings to mind one of the most striking images in his memoir, his description of living in a sewer where the juices of a rotting epoch drain. I mean, that's a pretty bleak assessment of the state of the world, even for a self-proclaimed
Yeah.
pessimist.
Well, he certainly didn't sugarcoat his views, but amidst the pessimism, there's also this glimmer of hope. He writes that nothing that has been done or thought is ever lost. He believed that even in the darkest of times, human creativity and the pursuit of knowledge could offer a path forward.
There's a resilience there, a belief in the enduring power of human thought and expression. And it's interesting how he blurs the lines between the arts and sciences. He even says, from where I sit, stand or lie, the sciences are not essentially different from the arts. I only wish they could have remained equally useless.
Yeah, he saw both as expressions of the human spirit, driven by curiosity and this desire to create, to understand. And he lamented the fact that science had become so focused on practical applications and usefulness that it had lost some of its inherent beauty and wonder.
It's a reminder that science shouldn't just be about, results and applications, but also about the joy of exploration and discovery. It's about asking questions, challenging assumptions, and expanding our understanding of the world around us.
And Chargaff's life really embodied that spirit. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking, to question the status quo, to advocate for a more humane and responsible approach to science.
So what can we as individuals navigating this, increasingly complex world of scientific advancements take away from Erwin Chargaff's life and work? What's the lasting message here?
I think he would urge us to cultivate a sense of humility in the face of the vast unknowns of the universe, to resist the temptation to reduce everything to simple explanations, and to remember that the pursuit of knowledge should be driven by a genuine desire to understand, not just to control.
It's about appreciating the complexity and mystery of the world, even as we strive to understand it.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that science is not a neutral force. It's shaped by human values and can be used for good or for ill.
Hmm.
And we have this responsibility to think critically about the implications of scientific advancements and to advocate for their ethical and responsible use.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive into Erwin Chargaff's Heraclitean fire, from his unique upbringing and his scientific breakthroughs to his growing disillusionment and his call for a more humane approach to science.
Yeah, it's a journey that's both inspiring and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It prompts us to consider what kind of science we want to create and what kind of legacy we want to leave for future generations.
It's a conversation worth continuing, and I hope our listeners will be inspired to, explore Chargaff's work for themselves. His voice, though, from the past, speaks directly to the challenges and opportunities we face today in this era of, rapid scientific advancement.
He reminds us that science is ultimately a human endeavor, and its future really depends on the choices that we make today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those sparks of knowledge that ignite our curiosity and lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.